Hello, everyone. I'd like to get started. I'm Denise Mazeral, a professor joint between the Woodrow Wilson School's Center for Policy Research on Energy and Environment and the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. I'm delighted to welcome you and Dr. Suzi Kerr to the Bradford Seminar Series today. Suzi and I actually go a long way back. We were graduate students at Harvard together, where she distinguished herself early as an economist interested in atmospheric science. And that's how we first crossed paths. We've actually crossed paths several times since then in various scientific meetings and policy meetings around the world, including in Cape Town, South Africa. And I think the last time we actually physically saw each other, I was visiting in New Zealand, where she was leading the Motu Economic and Public Policy Research Center, which she had founded in Wellington, New Zealand. While she was there, she's produced respected nonpartisan research on the environment, agriculture, labor, productivity, and human rights. She's worked closely with government, donors, and private sector CEOs seeking market-based solutions to environmental challenges. In addition to her work at Motu, Suzi made contributions to the evolution of modern reducing emissions, deforestation, and forest degradation efforts, often known as REDD, R-E-D-D, and played a central role in the design of the New Zealand emissions trading system, which led to her appointment to the country's interim climate change committee. She's also co-led 3 international programs on emissions trading, the design of a roadmap to emissions trading services systems in Chile, the handbook Emissions Trading in Practice, and design of an emission trading system for Colombia. She's participated in several international scientific steering groups as well. She's also served as a visiting professor at the University of Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and at Stanford University. She's worked as a visiting scholar at MIT's Technology Center for Energy and Environmental Policy and Research and the Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change, and as a visiting researcher at Resources for the Future. She taught for several years at both Victoria University of Wellington and the University of Maryland at College Park. When the C-PREE faculty were discussing possible speakers for the seminar series last spring, I proposed Suzi, thinking this was a great opportunity to bring her in from far off New Zealand when we were going to be doing things virtually rather than in person, which of course, coming from New Zealand would have been beyond what was possible for us. And you can imagine my surprise and delight when I realized that she has now become the chief economist at the Environmental Defense Fund and was actually in New York. Sadly, we still don't have her here in person, but there's opportunities, I think, in the future to see her more close up and personally. But for now, I'm delighted to welcome you, Suzi. It's terrific to have you here on my screen in my home. And we look forward to your talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Denise. I just share my screen. Fantastic. I hope you're seeing the right screen there. So, kia ora tātou, and ko mangawhā taku manga, ko otaki taku awa. In New Zealand, it is very common to introduce a, sorry, my slides are not working. I'm just going to make them go, sorry. It's very common to introduce a presentation in Māori, which is the Indigenous language, and tell people a little bit about where you're from. So these are some images that reflect where I'm from. I'm very honored to be here today. As Denise said, we've known each other a long time, and I have enormous respect for the work she does. It's also a great honor to be part of the David Bradford series because I had the honor of meeting him a few times, and what a wonderful and inspiring person he was as well. So I'm now at the Environmental Defense Fund, and we are an economics-based advocacy program, and we have more than 30 environmental economists. We also have a very strong science program, so science is a critical part of what we do. And we have office and presence both around the United States, but also in many developing countries. And I lead the Office of the Chief Economist, which is a small piece within that overall group. It's about 700 staff globally. So very exciting to be here at Stanford. One of the things that helps us to survive is our links to outstanding students and outstanding faculty who provide the support that we need to make the advocacy we do really effective. We also offer fellowships, in particular for Princeton, there's a High Meadows Fellowship, and we have internships at various levels for students as well. So these are other ways we interact. And we're always looking for the potential for research collaboration where there are problems that we're struggling with and where we need answers, and we'd like to work with excellent people to try and solve some of those. So the key messages from the talk I'm going to give today is that the world needs to transition to net zero emissions fast. We all know that. What I want to focus on is transfers across countries, making the argument that effective transfers across countries, and I'm talking about transfers of resources, skills, knowledge, will help us go faster and get to a stable climate at a lower temperature and with less damage. I will also argue that transfers for the sort of large scale mitigation that is needed in the enhanced mutual ambition require shared vision, trust, and true collaboration. It's not an arm's length market transaction in the way that a lot of people talk about international carbon markets as though they're just like an international financial market. And I'm going to discuss a model that I've been developing with some international colleagues for a number of years now called the Climate Team, which is one mechanism to mobilize resources to accelerate the transition of developing and emerging economies to low emissions. It's an aspirational mechanism that would only apply to a relatively small group of countries now, but it sort of gives some indication of the sorts of features of transfer mechanisms that we need in order to make them effective. So critical elements are that they need to be large scale, ambitious reductions over a long time frame rather than project scale, which is how offsets are generally considered. And also, I think that the relationships need to be among small groups of countries rather than trying to get large numbers of people all trying to have trading arrangements and transfer arrangements that work in a consistent way. So just to give a little bit of context, this is some other modelling, basically showing how inadequate our current global ambition is. So the black line is business as usual global emissions. The green line at the bottom is one pathway of emissions that would lead to a 2-degree stabilisation. So we'd really like to be below that if we can. And the blue is what the current ambition is of stated nationally determined contributions. Clearly not nearly strong enough, and we're not even 100% sure that all countries are going to achieve that blue. So what we're trying to do is achieve the blue line and move that blue line down towards the green line. That involves 11 billion tonnes more of reductions every year out to 2035. And it involves 2.4 trillion in clean investment per year in the energy sector alone. So we're talking about a huge scale problem. It can't be dealt with incrementally. It can't be dealt with through small mechanisms or aid-like mechanisms. So in order to achieve the sorts of goals we're talking about, it involves actors at all levels. So internationally, we have the United Nations process, which is critical. It's among nations. And then one way of thinking about this is that it helps to set the general ground rules and the framework at an international level. Then the different countries, and I've just shown 2 here, they create goals and policies in order to achieve their commitments. And then those policies and goals filter down to the individual actors. They could be investors, they could be companies, they could be households, they could be students. And that's one way of thinking of it. You can also think of it the other way around, that the investors, the companies, the students, the activists, the advocates are pushing on the national governments to have more ambitious goals and policies, make more ambitious commitments that they then take up to the UN level. So this is what's sometimes called a 2-level or a multi-level game, where the movement of effort goes in both directions. So I was asked to say something about divestment, because I know that this is a live issue on the campus in Princeton. So what do I think about divestment? I think, yes, divestment is a great idea. And from a narrow economics point of view, there's some real risk to the value of assets, both from climate policy, we're successful as activists and advocates, and also just from the climate change itself. And so that risk to the assets is a compelling argument to get some people to divest from them. But also I think more where things like the divestment movement is getting at is the moral arguments. There's a lot of symbolic value from saying we're not going to have anything to do with this. And top priority, again, going back with my economics hat, would be divestment from coal and from oil and gas exploration, which are unequivocally inconsistent with any 2 degrees pathway. Some people would argue that rather than divesting, groups should stay within the companies and use their power as a stakeholder through stakeholder activism. But you'd have to be a really big stakeholder to actually have any impact on these fossil fuel companies. So in most instances, that's not a very valid argument. Also with my economics hat on, I have to say that although I totally encourage people to push for these sorts of policies, alone they're not going to be very effective. There is so much capital in the world, and you would have to get divestment of the vast majority of it to begin to have an impact, that on its own, this is not going to have a lot of impact. The real impact is the signalling value of it. And also another sort of concern I have is that, yes, I can understand why you would say we don't want to work with polluters, but somebody's got to work with polluters. And I have to say this because we work actively with polluters because they have direct control over the assets. They're the ones who have control over the levers we're actually trying to change in many instances. And some of them might even be genuine and trying to make a change, but they need help. And so we need to work with them sometimes to make that help. But as we do that, we have to be really careful that we're not being brought in to their processes as well. So mixed message there, I think, but go for it, be active, be activists. And then reinvestment, which is also mentioned, is absolutely critical, and also the role that all of us can play in all sorts of different roles. It doesn't have to be as a scientist, it doesn't have to be as an economist or a policymaker. Climate change is such a complex problem, it affects everybody in the world. So that's really the critical action that we can take, as well as being an activist in various spaces. So moving back to the main thread, how do we get these changes to happen? So at an international scale, we're talking about what are called self-enforcing agreements. We don't have international government. We can't think of this as a regulatory problem where we tell people what to do, we set rules, and then we have some sort of global police force who implements them. That's not actually possible to do that. And if we could, it possibly wouldn't be the sort of future that we really want anyway. So we're talking about agreements that are self-enforcing. People stay in them because they think it's a better way forward and that they trust each other to help cooperating. And we've had a number of goes at this. Some of these have been more successful than others. I know Denise was heavily involved in the Montreal Protocol, which was very successful in dealing with ozone depletion. The Kyoto Protocol, which mimicked that, was not so successful, and it's eventually phased out completely. So now we have the United Nations Paris Agreement. It's essentially trying to get the sort of agreement the countries will stick with and that will gradually become stronger. This is frustrating that we can't have a global police force, that we can't just find a nice technical solution and impose it. It would be great to be able to do that. If we could have done that 20 years ago, we wouldn't be in the position we are today. But on the optimistic side, game theory from economics tells us that it is possible to actually achieve cooperative outcomes in a game like this because it's repeated, because you play it over and over again. And because people can threaten not only to not cooperate in this game, but also not cooperate in other games like trade and other activities, we can potentially actually achieve the cooperation we need. In Paris, the Paris Agreement through the United Nations is really critical to this because you can only cooperate with people if you can see what they're doing. And seeing what they're doing in this instance requires standardized monitoring rules, it requires transparency, and also you can only do it if you can coordinate, if you can talk to each other and mutually agree on what are acceptable contributions to the problem. So Paris and the United Nations process is absolutely critical and in the center of this. But going beyond that, climate stability requires that all countries reach net zero. And for New Zealand, for countries in the European Union, for the United States, it might be totally reasonable that this would involve a rapid decarbonisation reaching zero at 2050 or hopefully even earlier. But other countries on their own might not be expected to get there that fast. They are struggling with poverty, they're struggling with conflict, and now they're struggling with serious issues with COVID and public health. So a country like Chile, which is still growing, it has growing population, growing living standards, which is real because there's still a lot of poverty in Chile. You might expect that on their own, they might reach net zero by 2050, but they might go a bit slower along the pathway. China might go a little slower again and may reach 2050 later. These are made up curves. A country like Kenya, a much poorer country, might be expected on their own without help to take quite a long time to get to net zero. Most mitigation has to happen in these countries, which on their own are unlikely to get there rapidly. So, and the reason for that is not because they've done most of the emissions in the past, it's because without effort, because they're growing and because they're a lot of the world, they're going to do a lot of the emissions in the future. So this is from the Energy Information Administration, it's a forecast, and you look at that picture and even excluding China, there's an enormous amount of emissions that would happen in 2040 if we don't do anything about it. So they're going to need some help to get those emissions down. We know from game theory that if we can make transfers of resources across countries as we're coordinating in processes like the United Nations, then we can cooperate more. That means we can enhance ambition, we can accelerate the transition, and we can stabilize at a lower temperature. We also know that it's not just about cash, it's about investment as well. So coordinating on technology and investment in clean tech, as well as coordinating on constraining emissions is even more effective than just having agreements in terms of total emissions. So transfers can lower cost and help enhance ambition. The transfers, because of the nature of the way the United Nations works, are between sovereign countries. So the transfers of mitigation, that's mitigation, extra mitigation done by one country and resources coming from the other country. It's like a trade. That happens among countries. Modelling suggests that if we were to mitigate efficiently across the whole world, we would need about 2 to 4 billion tonnes of transfer per year between countries. For context, since it began under the Clean Development Mechanism, there has been 4 billion tonnes of transfer. So over the entire program, whereas we will need to be doing that every year. So the scale of what we need to do, if we're going to do it efficiently, and we're unlikely to achieve that, but if we can move in that direction, we can be more effective, we can do things faster, and that's what we need to be able to do. So why else would you do transfers across country? The main reason is this gains in trade. Rather than the developed countries trying to accelerate their mitigation when it becomes outrageously expensive, they can help other countries who would have the opportunity to mitigate a lot more, but really struggle with it because of their other priorities. But there are also other reasons to have these relationships between countries and not just see it as a problem where every country just focuses internally and deals with their own emissions. It's easier to get things through politically if you can point to other countries you're working with. Because you can say, well, we're not the only ones doing this. Other people are doing this. This is normal behaviour. This is something that we have external support for. It also helps with capacity. None of us have done this before. It's not easy to mitigate, even when you try really hard. So we can learn a lot from each other on how to do that. And that learning can happen in both directions. For companies, if there are transfer and there are close relationships between countries who are competing in product markets, it's likely you'll be able to harmonise regulation better. You'll avoid leakage of emissions across countries. You'll avoid some of the competitiveness issues and just some of the red tape if one company is working in multiple countries. And critically, it enables the investors to invest in companies in other countries because those other countries, we'll call that Kenya for a moment, is going to have policies within Kenya that will be favourable and supportive of clean investment. So that will make it easier for investors from another country to come in. So how do we create and transfer high integrity units on a large scale? What are the mechanisms, legal and policy mechanisms, that we can do between countries in order to do this effectively? So transfers are between governments. They have to comply with the requirements under what's called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. The rules for Article 6 are the only part of the Paris Agreement that hasn't been finalised yet, but basically there's a lot of agreement among countries on what high quality transfers would actually look like. So these were summarised in the San Jose principles, and they include things like environmental integrity, high ambition, that transfers accelerate mitigation, that there's no double counting, and I'll come back to that a little later. And it avoids locking in technologies that are inconsistent with long-term goals. So the transfers have to be consistent with the goals that we're actually trying to achieve at a global level. That's a challenge. How can we transfer? What are the mechanisms that we have already? One is that we can transfer through linking emissions trading systems, and there's a lot of literature on this. One extreme example is where we talk about mutual recognition of units, where units from one emissions trading system are recognised in the other and vice versa. Or it could just go one way. One country accepts another country's units, but not in reverse. Emissions trading systems and taxes, emissions taxes, or sometimes people call these carbon taxes. I like to say emissions taxes because carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. They're really widespread now. They actually cover 22% of the world's emissions in quite a range of countries. So there's a lot of instances where this could be something that could be effective. And that set of countries continues to expand. The other mechanism which we have already used is what's sometimes called offsets or credits, clean development units, CERs, various different names for the same thing. But essentially they're project-related reductions that get sold across countries. They're sold across countries. There's also a voluntary market. And here I'm not focused on the voluntary market. So what are our experiences with linking and with these offsets? The European Union, in a sense, the European Union emissions trading system is a great big linked system. They're all under the same rules. They're all under one legal framework. They allowed some linkage to offsets. So they used clean development units. They eventually decided to seriously limit those and ultimately ban them because of concerns about the quality of those offsets, which is actually a fundamental problem with offsets. They also have experience joining with Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. They had an agreement with Australia, which then collapsed because the government changed in Australia, and they've linked with Switzerland. California and Quebec have one of the very famous linkages. They formed in 2014. It's a linkage that is based in a much broader governance system. So there's a shared vision for what they're trying to achieve. They've got a very flexible way of adapting to change in that system. They suffered a challenge when Ontario tried to join them. It did very briefly join their system, and then they too had a political change and had to exit. New Zealand took a different and, looking backwards, a bad approach to linkage. We allowed unlimited clean development mechanism units under the Kyoto Protocol. And what happened to us is that they completely drove our domestic price down to zero. And so ultimately we're unlinked in 2012. So something you'll notice from this is that the full ETS linkages so far are among very, very similar countries. They're all OECD countries. They're countries with similar income levels and similar levels of ambition. So it's not a situation like I was talking about where a richer country can help a poorer country like Chile or Kenya to accelerate their transition. It's much more just about market linking. If you're going to have those sort of full ETS linkages, you have to have strong, stable emissions trading systems. So lots of countries have emissions trading systems, or they have emissions taxes, which you can use also as the basis of some forms of linkage. but they don't have ones that are so strong that another country would trust the quality of that regulation. In order to link to someone else's system, you need confidence in the ambition of their system, in their monitoring, reporting, and verification, in their enforcement and compliance. And you need to be sure that that is actually going to persist over time as well, because you are essentially buying into their rules. You can link systems that are intensity or absolute caps. That's a possibility. If you're going to link with somebody else, you need to agree on the ambition of the country before the link so that you can manage the distributional consequences. Because when you link two systems, that can lead to quite a significant change in the price faced by both countries, both the one who ends up mostly buying and the one that ends up mostly selling. That has real implications politically, and it leads to transfer of resources across those countries. In some instances, partly because of this concern about distribution, in most of the instances of formal external linkages, there's been a requirement of similar levels of ambition or similar prices before the link. That avoids those distributional problems. It avoids large transfers of resources across countries, but also means you're getting no gains from trade out of the systems. So it doesn't solve our fundamental problem of the mitigation needing to happen somewhere that the resources are not. The other thing you really need to make these work is strong governance, because things change over time. So as we've noticed, politics change. Australia's government changed, Ontario's government changed. In those cases, it forced a removal of the linkage. It was too big a change to negotiate your way through. But also there will be changes in nationally determined contributions. You can't plan everything in advance. You have to manage that loss of political control, particularly if you're a small country linking with a large country. You're not going to have much say in the rules anymore. So you want to have at least some influence over things that are going to be critical for you. You also need to do some technical things, simply because the rules in one system, the systems are unlikely to be completely identical, and the rules in one system can really have material effects on the other system. So that just needs to be carefully aligned. So mitigation is not a commodity. Even in the cases where we've got linked emissions trading systems so that the units do get traded in very sophisticated financial markets, underlying those trades are long-term relational contracts between the countries. Long-term governance, long-term trust, long-term shared goals and vision. In some cases, those relationships between the countries could be so strong you can have full ETS linking, but that's very uncommon, and we haven't seen it at all between countries that are very different levels of development. So can we take the existing trust relationships that we do have between countries that are at different levels of development and support relationships that will enable large-scale transfer of resources and mitigation among very different countries? It's hard to design these agreements. There are a whole series of problems that we have to overcome when we're thinking about this. The first is the problem of free riding. Because we can't enforce and because we don't trust each other fully, we're always vulnerable to one country trying to do something that will benefit them but not the others, or both countries trying to do something that will benefit them both but not the climate as a whole. Second problem, the economics term for it is adverse selection. In the literature, so wider literature about climate, it's usually called non-additionality, which is the problem that you tend to pay people to do mitigation they were going to do anyway. And that's not helpful because that's not accelerating mitigation. Third problem is what economists call dynamic adverse selection, or the problem of ambition. You might want to lie, or that's probably too strong a word, but hide the potential you have for reducing on your own account, because that means that you're more likely to have resources transferred to you. Moral hazard is about managing risk. We have to really decide how to manage the risks over time and how they get shared across the countries. And problem of incomplete contracts, which leads to what we call time inconsistency or hold up, which is a problem that arises in the CDM. I think the Clean Development Mechanism illustrates this quite well, that under the Kyoto Protocol, we designed the clean development mechanism, we made it work, we told developing countries and companies within developing countries that if they mitigated, that they would get rewarded for that, that they would be able to sell units. Often people would quote prices that were quite high based on modeling of what prices would need to be. And then by the time a lot of those projects really got going, the system had changed, the Kyoto Protocol had ended, and nobody wanted the units that they were getting. That's called hold up. When the system changes, they had no bargaining power. They'd already made the investments. They'd already started doing the mitigation. People are now looking at those projects and saying, we don't need to transfer resources to them. They're already doing it. But of course, the only reason they did it was they thought they'd get rewards. And the problem with that, you can get away with that once, but in future, they're going to be really skeptical and they're not going to make investments unless they're more confident that they'll get real returns. In addition to these sort of contracting problems, which are classic econ problems, there are challenges with capital markets that you need to overcome. There's no point in having an agreement among governments if the private sector isn't going to actually mobilize capital to make the changes that are needed. Often the governments you're dealing with just have a lack of capacity. There aren't enough people involved who you can talk to. There aren't people who are capable of implementing programs. In the companies, there may not be the technical capacity to implement changes. And in general, we're just really bad at making decisions under uncertainty. And that's a problem we strike over and over again. So what do we do in the face of all these scary problems? So a group of us, mostly academics and some people who've been very involved in agreements and trying to implement some of these programs, have got together and we've tried to say, well, how would we design this if we were going to go from scratch? And how can we make a workable model that we could actually use to replace the sort of offset processes that are currently the main approach? So one thing that we looked at is choosing small self-selected teams. So choosing countries who already have relationships with each other and trust each other. So taking an example of a country we're talking with, but who aren't actively considering this yet, but we're trying to persuade them to. So that's Chile. Chile could choose some countries to work with. They already have close trading relationships. They have close personal relationships, cultural connections with New Zealand and Switzerland. These are countries who are happy working together, so they can potentially build that trust. Then you have to design the agreement. And the way that we think about the agreement is at a national scale. So this is national carbon dioxide equivalent emissions and over a long period of time. So the first step is to think about the business as usual emissions. And for many developing countries, this is something that is going up. That country is likely to have taken a nationally determined contribution, which is a reduction relative to its business as usual emissions. That's something that it's expecting to do on its own. In order to start having this contract, you have to agree on a crediting baseline that could be related to that nationally determined contribution, but it needs to go right across the time period, not just one particular year. That getting down from business as usual down onto that reducing emissions path is the responsibility of the country, of Chile in this case, supported by climate finance, which is funding that is essentially aid that is given to help countries achieve their NDCs. It's not in anticipation of any sort of transfer. Doing this at a large scale, the whole country, and using the existing nationally determined contribution as a baseline makes it a credible baseline. If you're trying to project BAU, it's incredibly difficult. And so saying that you got below BAU doesn't give you a great deal of confidence that it's actually additional, because it might just be that you projected BAU wrong. But if you're already 20% below business as usual, because the country has taken an ambitious nationally determined contribution, if you get even further than that and you can reduce emissions below that crediting baseline, you're much more confident that this is actually additional to what Chile was going to do on its own. And it's something they chose. Chile chose the NDC. That's something that is more likely to be locally acceptable. So this is very helpful under the Paris Agreement. And then over time, what happens is that you take the emissions inventory, which is the inventory at a national level of what the total emissions are in Chile, designed under standard rules. So, and there's a process around checking these inventories. They're not perfect, but they're improving. We can see what people have done, we can criticize, we can improve. And that gives a measure of the national emissions. Should be done in a way that's consistent with the way the nationally determined contribution is assessed. It's consistent, hopefully also with the way the business as usual projection was done. And the way that you tell that they've actually made reductions is that it's lower. The green line is lower than the purple line, and the difference between those is your estimate of additional reductions. And those are done by the country because they anticipate that they're going to get funding as a reward for those, or they may have contracts where they've already got some funding. Because it's done with the national inventory, it makes it more credible. It's not something that is mysterious and done on data that is not public. And there's no extra transactions cost for the developing country who's involved in this. They are already doing national inventories. They are beginning to do them more regularly. They might want to do them even more regularly as a result of this, but they're not having to create a whole new framework for monitoring, reporting and verification that is different and that may be inconsistent with the rest of their planning. So this is a different way of visualizing the way the climate team works. You have this group of countries, partner countries, and a host country. And you can see that the partner country is providing money and tools to the host countries and receiving what are called ITMOs, internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, which are yet another word for units or credits that can be used by the partner country to help them achieve their commitments if they've made ambitious commitments. The terms under which that money flows, that technical support flows, and those ITMOs flow are under the terms of the climate change agreement from the host country. But then the thing that's different from a lot of these programs is that the host country can achieve the reductions through a whole lot of different approaches. They could use REDD or avoided deforestation programs in different jurisdictions. They could have a transport policy that involves building better public transport systems. They could have a domestic emissions trading system. It doesn't have to be projects. It doesn't have to be a pricing mechanism. It's any policy that the developing country really thinks is going to be effective in reducing their emissions. And as we know, in developed countries, we don't use project mechanisms to reduce our emissions in the US or in Europe. We do a little, but that's not the major thing that we do. So we need to provide the same flexibility to developing countries to use the whole range of effective policies. So if they do all this, then the reductions are the difference, the area underneath the crediting baseline and above the inventory line. And the money would flow to them for that total amount of transfers that of reductions that they've been successful in achieving. So what has to happen to make it possible for a developing country to actually engage in something like this? It's very different than anything that's been done before. It's much more ambitious, it's much larger scale, and that's scary to them. So what do they need to make this work and to make this attractive? If we're asking a country like Chile to really significantly accelerate its mitigation above what they are agreeing to do in their nationally determined contribution, which already is reasonably ambitious, they're going to need to do things like transition entirely to renewable electricity. That requires closing coal generators. That's going to have political resistance. They need to build large-scale solar plants. They need to build massive new infrastructure to manage, to increase transmission so that they can manage intermittency and move the power around. They're going to electrify transport. You're shifting a whole bus fleet and you might be changing your charging infrastructure. There are legal changes that are required. If they're going to do those things, which are not things they plan to do, and they're only doing them because they know they're getting resources from other countries to support them, they need to be confident that they really will get that money, that income flow is really going to come. And if they can be confident that that income is going to come, they can then create an environment that makes it attractive for investors to come too. They could offer some forms of subsidies, or they could offer other support that it makes it attractive for those investors. Maybe it's training staff that those, or skilled workers who those investors are going to need to make their investment successful. The hosts need credible demand. They need to be sure that, in this case, New Zealand and Switzerland are really actually going to come up with the money for the large number of units when the time comes. And how does a country like New Zealand demonstrate that it's credible? Well, one is to show that we're really serious about climate change. Show that in New Zealand, we have taken domestic action up to what is a reasonable cost, that we're not expecting Chile to do all our reductions for us, but not do anything at home. So we need to be doing real credible things in our own country. The other approach is a more mechanical one, which is that we could make a legal commitment to financing and support. We could even put the money up front in a sort of an impressed trust account that means that we don't control that money anymore. That's another way that we could make it credible that Chile really will get paid if they manage to achieve these reductions. But hosts need other things as well. They need the political support. Why on earth are you doing climate policy when we're in the middle of a COVID crisis and we have poverty and all these other things are going on in our country? They need some reasons to be doing that as well. They need capability, and they really need co-benefits. It's so hard to explain climate, even in a country like New Zealand where people are generally committed. It's so abstract that most people really can't conceive of it. So if you can have co-benefits that go with that economic development, bringing in new technology, improvements in air quality when you close down those coal plants, reductions in poverty because you're providing jobs in the clean industries. Those things are very useful for them to be able to tell the story that enables them to make this happen. What do partners need? What does Switzerland need in order to do this? They need internationally transferable mitigation outcomes so they can meet their Paris targets, so they can be in compliance. Countries like New Zealand and Switzerland have taken quite ambitious targets relative to what we think we can do domestically. It's hard for us to go a lot faster. We can certainly go faster than we're going, but to get to where we have said we will go would be extremely difficult, mostly because we haven't got our act together before, but we're now where we are. But those units have to be credible. If we're going to spend our resources in another country, we have to be confident that we're really getting something of value. And we have to be able to convince other people of that as well, because they'd say, well, why aren't we spending that on reductions in New Zealand? Or why aren't we spending that on all the poverty that the recent COVID depression has created? There are other things to do with that money as well. And New Zealand, as one example, and Europe has experienced the same, has been very burned by very low quality clean development and joint implementation units. So there's a lot of skepticism. We need credible supply. We need the host to demonstrate to us that they really will be able to provide us with these ITMOs. If we spend a lot of time talking with them, setting up the agreement, committing ourselves in advance, expending political capital, we need to be confident that they actually can exceed their nationally determined contribution. They can demonstrate that through modelling. They can demonstrate that by showing that they have policy capability because they have the instruments, the levers already implemented that they can use. Or they could show that they have specific transformational projects that they would be able to implement if they had some extra resources. Unlike under the Kyoto Protocol, under Paris, the host has a commitment too. Any units that are transferred to partners can't be used for domestic compliance anymore. That's really different than it used to be. And they can't be transferred to others. If Chile sold units to another country, that makes it even more likely that they won't have units to sell to New Zealand and Switzerland. So we have a direct interest in them not selling units that would have been ours in a sense. Uncertainty about the compliance falls on the host country, and now it also falls on those who are expecting to receive units, but won't if they don't achieve and overachieve their target. Some developing countries often talk about the concern that they are going to sell their low-hanging fruit. That's quite avoidable, though it doesn't mean it will be avoided, but it is avoidable. Don't sell cheap. You don't sell at the cost of the reductions, you sell at the market price, what people are willing to pay, what it's worthwhile to them. And only sell when it's beyond your own NDC. So you are confident that you're going to achieve your NDC and more. When you have these sort of arrangements with another country, make sure that their resources are used to transform your economy, not to just reduce emissions for a short period of time, but change it in ways that are less likely to be reversed, that are going to make it easier to keep your emissions lower in the future. There isn't a fixed bucket of potential reductions out there to sell, and when you sell them to one person, they're not available to another. So just a quick illustration of this. In the first period, this might be your marginal abatement cost curve, and there's a certain price that it's going to cost you to get to your NDC, but you could reduce more if you are willing, if somebody's willing to pay you above that dotted line price. What you want is that those efforts in period one actually lower your marginal abatement cost curve, because it gets the laws in place, it gets some of the infrastructure in place, and it sort of starts you rolling down the path of decarbonisation. So both hosts and partners need they need credibility in the eyes of the other countries, particularly when you're talking about little countries like New Zealand or Chile or Switzerland. Our own actions don't have a huge impact on global emissions, but if our example can lead others to copy us or feel ashamed or feel enabled, then we can have a much bigger impact. So it's really important that we are showing that we're doing this in a credible way. And those are just some ways that we can show that what we're doing is credible, and it's not just a way to look as though we're complying, but not really do it. So how does the climate team work mechanically? Here are some of the countries that might be the partner countries. They've committed a certain amount of climate finance. Once they're in the agreement, they have an incentive to direct that towards the Chilean government and make sure that it's used effectively so that Chile actually achieves its NDC. Then a second component is that it's not only selling credits, it's what price you sell the credits at. So you need to negotiate those prices. A minimum price that protects Chile and a maximum price that protects the partner countries, so that they know that they're not going to have to pay the market price. That's their reward for making pre-commitments. And the pre-commitment could be in the form of advance funding to purchase the Atmos. It's very hard for the treasury of any even developed country to come up with a lot of money in advance. So what could happen is that they could have companies who have a private agreement with the government of the partner country, and they put in the cash up front under the understanding that they're going to get the units that they can use for their own domestic compliance later. That money could go into something called the Chilean Climate Fund, and then that money only goes to Chile after they've done their national inventory, they've shown they've made reductions. And you need these external observers. There is, unfortunately, always an incentive for anybody in any of these agreements to make it just a bit easier for everybody involved. And we saw this over and over again in clean development mechanism projects. The incentive is to make it easy to generate units, because then you have more. You can comply with them, you can sell them. So you need people on the outside to be able to see what you're doing and provide an assurance that there really is environmental integrity, and keep pushing you to make sure that's true. So to design a climate teams agreement, there's a lot of aspects that you need to talk through. Some of them are technical, some of them are more negotiation. Issues of environmental integrity, making sure you've got that enhanced ambition, thinking about the timing of sales so you don't sell units that later get reversed. Efficiency, how do you set it up so that it is as efficient as possible in the signals it provides to the developing country so that they can actually make the mitigation happen. So it's not too constraining, so it helps them get finance. Equity is critical. How do you share the gains, but also how do you share the risks? One mechanism for dealing with that is the price range, but there are other mechanisms as well. And endurance. This is a marathon or a sprint, as we always say. It really matters how we set up the governance, how we set up the relationships among the people, so that as things change, as they inevitably will, in ways that we can't anticipate, that we have systems for actually dealing with those changes and making sure that people are confident that there is a long-term price signal. Because investment is about long-term price signals, not short-term ones. So, in summary, think large and small. We need to think about this as a large-scale reduction, not as an incremental problem or offsetting or small-scale changes. We have to be brave. Large, multi-year agreements are what we're looking for. But work in small groups of countries underneath the United Nations framework, for sure, and not by not talking to other countries, but it's much easier to develop deep trust and relationships among small groups of countries. And that's what really matters for creating an environment that will allow investment, that will allow increased ambition. I will stop there. So thank you all very much. I look forward to your questions.
I just got a prompt to say unmute. I don't know if you were able to hear me before, but I would like to ask you the first question before I turn it over to the audience following your really interesting talk, which is related to the way the Montreal Protocol addressed something very similar to what you're discussing, which is through putting together voluntary teams between a developed and a developing country. But that was different in the sense it was entirely voluntary and intended to build capacity to facilitate a phase out of the ozone depleting substances. Do you see any possibility of something that's more on the voluntary basis without this very complex governance structure being effective in terms of facilitating uptake of, renewable energy or other mechanisms that might leapfrog over the fossil technology?
I think that ultimately, this all depends on people's willingness to cooperate, lots and lots of people's willingness to cooperate and do these sorts of things voluntarily. I don't think that that's going to get us very far on its own. And there's plenty of literature that shows that voluntary agreements just don't have much effect, except curiously in Japan, but that may be that they're not truly voluntary, that actually the government is sort of threatening to regulate behind the scenes. As soon as something gets really costly and difficult, voluntary just isn't enough, because those who act make themselves less profitable relative to those who don't. That doesn't mean that people can't act, but there's a limit to how much they can do on their own. Their action can enable the government to push their competitors further through, but that has to be through regulation.
Okay, well, thanks for that. We're going to take questions now from the audience, and if you want to first raise your hand, I will identify you, and then if you could unmute yourself, you can ask your question. The first person I'd like to ask his question is Professor Robert Cohane.
Thanks very much, Susie. I haven't seen you in 20 years. Can you hear me?
I can. It's lovely to hear you, even if I can't.
It was a great talk, and it was entirely consistent with international relations theory over the last 25 years.
That's a relief. Bob taught me back in Harvard days, so I'm pleased.
The three key points: small groups, limiting free riding because you can't make agreements with huge groups, emphasizing rules-based institutionalized reciprocity, not just reciprocity, which can deteriorate, but a kind of rules-based reciprocity, and credibility, as you emphasized. You didn't talk as much about the incentives of politicians to gain credit in the short term. And it was implicit in your implication that politicians will try to reduce the integrity of systems so they can claim more credit now, because the reduction in integrity won't become evident until they're out of office. Can you say a few more words about them? The Montreal case is indicative because they made a very smart decision in that the commitments were made now, but the costs were off in the future for the less developed countries. From 1972 until 2015, I think some of the costs were incurred. And so the politicians who accepted the commitments in a binding way knew that they wouldn't have to deliver. Their successors would have to deliver, and they couldn't care less about their successors' costs. So what can you say about that? How can that be leveraged in to take advantage, the way Montreal did, of the time horizons of policy?
Yeah, I think some of that is still playing out, and the commitments now are for 2030, which is long beyond any reasonable political horizon for at least democratically elected politicians. But of course, the problem with that is that when 2030 arises, the current politicians aren't necessarily still committed to it. So I think in the case of the Montreal Protocol, when the time came, it wasn't too difficult. And there was a lot of pressure from other countries to keep complying with that, which made that really work. Yeah, and politicians always want to play the short game. I think that's where co-benefits are a really important story for them, that you might get the co-benefits quite rapidly. And those are very visible. And if it's cleaning up air, which in many cases, at least according to modeling, is almost free to do. So there's immediate local benefits from a lot of these things in developing countries, because you're not looking at countries who've already optimized all their policies. There's a lot of unachieved gains there. So if you can get them those sort of rewards early on, and then get the changes in policy embedded, by the time 2030 comes and you've got a different politician, they may find it harder to change, not because of international pressure, but because of domestic rules that are already imposed. I don't know if that fully addresses what you were asking.
Yes, it does. It's a good answer. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And the co-benefits are super important. I couldn't agree more with that. Our next person with their hand up is Whitney Colella. Go ahead.
Hey, Suzi, thanks for your talk. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
So I liked your talk. Thanks very much. One of my concerns is with a lot of these analyses, they seem to assume that countries know precisely what their CO2 emissions are. And in my observation, that assumption is correct. I've worked extensively with the US Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration databases, which are the source of the CO2 emissions data for the US, and they're fairly imprecise in many different ways, including that the data comes in part from voluntary reporting from industry, and either intentionally or by accident, a lot of that voluntary reporting could be inaccurate quite easily. And the US has one of the best databases. By contrast, other countries like Egypt don't even publicly disclose, the government doesn't publicly disclose their data. So one of my main concerns is that it's a practicality of this approach, because as an engineer and someone who's looked at the data, the engineering and science data, I know that this is, there's a lot of uncertainty in the underlying CO2 emissions data, for example. Thank you.
Right. Great question. Thank you. Thank you, Whitney. So this is a question that comes up often, and of course we don't accurately measure what we're trying to cooperate on. And I think there are two key things to think about there. One is that what we are looking at is changes in those levels. So although even the US inventory probably has quite a high error factor, and EDF has been very active in showing how high a factor that is for methane, that the changes across years, if you use consistent approaches, have much lower levels of error. So what you're looking at is change relative to a baseline. That makes it critical that the methodologies you use for your crediting baseline and your inventory are identical, and that as they get updated, they both get updated. So that's one of the issues. The other thing is that it's very rare, in fact, that when we regulate something, we can completely observe the things that we care about. What we care is that they are correlated and that there aren't incentives for people to break that correlation. So, for example, when we regulate fisheries and control the number of fish that are caught, we don't really care about the number of fish that are caught. We care about the number of fish who are left in the sea. And so we're only regulating something that is correlated with the number of fish left in the sea. And as long as that correlation works, we're not going to have a perfect policy, but we're going to achieve part of what we want to achieve. So it's the same thing here. As long as the changes in that national inventory are correlated with true reductions in emissions, we're getting there. And if we can improve the inventory, we can target it even more accurately and do even better. So we need to keep on improving that measurement, but that we don't have to wait until we can do it really well before we start to make big changes.
Great, well, thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation and discussion. We're out of time for the formal part of the seminar. So I think what I'll do, if it's okay with you, Suzi, is to stop the recording and invite people who would like to have some informal conversations with you to stick around for a few minutes.
That'd be great.
Sort of simulating what we've done typically in the lecture hall. And thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you all.